Headliner Nation, what is going on? Kyle back with the Fantasy Headliners. In today's tight end video, definitely late because I'm in the middle of researching, recording, and then all of a sudden we get news of a trade involving one of the top fantasy option tight ends in the league right now. We're going to jump into that in this video and break that down a little bit more for you. Hit that like button for me. Subscribe to the channel if you are new here, and we need to absolutely roll into all the information right away. And it's going to kick off on Thursday Night Football. Philadelphia is going to be getting Houston this week, which means Dallas Goedert will be a start for us. At least 6 targets in all but 2 of his games this season. And we just have to hope the targets come in the first half. Right now, Philadelphia is a team where almost half, if not more, of their fantasy points are coming in the first half of the games, whereas all of a sudden they start to slow when you get into the third quarter, and then almost nothing in the first quarter or fourth quarter because they're getting out to big leads. And because of that, we have to make sure that all that happens in the front end, especially a team like Houston where Philadelphia could get out early. We got to hope that Dallas Goedert has a big first half. Jordan Akins for Houston, I thought he would have a shot to help us last week. Really turned out to be nothing, which seems to be the case when it comes to Jordan Akins and the Houston Texans. Not the first time they've burned me. No real reason here, a little bit of a tougher matchup, so we're going to be skipping out on him this week. The Chargers and the Atlanta Falcons. We saw a bounce back last week from Kyle Pitts, but will he continue to be a start moving forward? Well, first off, we got to talk about Gerald Everett going up against Atlanta. That allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. And on top of that, Mike Williams likely to miss more time. Is Allen 100%? Palmer was in the concussion protocol last week still. What are we going to get health-wise from this wide receiver core? Everett also may see Rashawn Allen in coverage. He has 298 routes covered against tight ends this season, and he allows an 85% catch rate to them. I'm going to go with Gerald Everett this week. I really like what he could bring to the table. Hopefully he's able to produce for us as well. For Kyle Pitts, I'm actually going to list him as a sit. Again, he finally had a big day last week, and I get the risk in sitting him again, knowing that and seeing that and hoping that he can break out moving forward. But he's probably going to see some Derwin James coverage this week, which is really never a good thing for tight ends. And Pitts right now only has 5 games over 80 receiving yards in his entire career so far, which is crazy to think given on how highly he was sought after coming out of the draft in terms of being a fantasy viable tight end. This year, however, only 2 games over 80 yards, and the rest of the 5 games he's played in, he's had 25 or less receiving yards. Miami and Chicago, and Mike Gesicki, we're not going to go with him for a 3rd straight week. We're going to be off this week, listing him as a sit. Not a great matchup by the numbers. However, one thing to keep in mind for me, though, is that obviously Robert Quinn, and then moving on from Roquan Smith, both of those things are going to bring the defense for the Chicago Bears down. I think we're going to see a lot of Hill. I think we're going to see a lot of Waddle. I think that we're going to see Tua with a lot of time to throw the football. And then running the football, if Miami can get up on Chicago maybe a little bit better than what happened last week against Detroit, then we can run the football a little bit more as well, which is going to leave Mike Gesicki really is just a guy that we hope has a touchdown at some point in time. Not going with it this week. Don't love it. Cole Kmet finally found the end zone last week, although he only had 10 receiving yards. And the Bears offense is starting to pick up, but they just made a trade for Chase Claypool. How is that going to affect the wide receivers and the tight ends? How long is it going to take Claypool to really get going in the offense? Does he make an impact? We'll talk about that more in the wide receiver video. This is a great matchup for Cole Kmet, so maybe he does find the end zone again, but it's going to be hard for me to bet on it this week. For Carolina, there's really nothing that we need to see in Carolina still. Even with CMC and Robbie Anderson being gone, Ian Thomas and Tommy Tremble still are not a thing there. For Hurst this past week, he was disappointing against Cleveland. Not a great night. But the whole offense was really kind of disappointing. I mean, T. Higgins, his entire day was made like off one 40-yard touchdown catch. That was basically all he did. Tyler Boyd didn't do anything except catching 1 touchdown. Joe Mixon wasn't able to do anything. The offensive line looked awful. So really nobody did a whole lot anyway. But this week, going up against Carolina, there is a chance that Hayden Hurst is going to see Frankie Louvu. 153 routes covered against tight ends this year, and he allows 0.32 fantasy points per route covered. That is 7th most in the league. Green Bay and Detroit, and we can just plaster who knows over the Detroit logo because We don't. TJ Hockenson just traded to Minnesota. What does that mean for Detroit? I'll talk about the trade when we get to Minnesota for Hockenson, but what does that mean for Detroit? For Detroit, I think this is good from a fantasy perspective for Amon-Ra St. Brown and Josh Reynolds, because it's going to allow targets for them to open up and be a little bit more readily available. Yes, TJ Hockenson wasn't making the best impact outside of like one huge game and like one okay game. But even with that being said, he was still taking a lot of targets on a per game basis. Those are going to have to go somewhere now because we know Detroit's defense isn't stopping anybody, so that's good. For DeAndre Swift, I think it's very, very neutral for him. Yes, it might add a couple of more targets, but it's not going to be good in the run game. TJ Hockenson was an excellent blocker, and I think that could hurt in the run game a little bit. And as far as whatever tight end steps up for Detroit, who knows? Because their number 2 tight end, he's in the concussion protocol. So I don't even know who's really going to be the tight end this week. We'll monitor it, maybe talk about it later. But for right now, we're just going to put who knows here because who knows. Robert Tonyan, though, for Green Bay, Detroit allows the 5th most fantasy points to tight end. They allowed a score last week to Mike Gesicki. I'm going to bet on Robert Tonyan finding the end zone again for me this week. Still a little bit more of a high risk, but going up against Detroit, I think Green Bay is going to want to get back on track, and they do it by throwing the football. Las Vegas and Jacksonville, and even with Darren Waller being on his bye already and hoping he would come back and able to get very limited practice in last week, still was not able to play. So for right now, we're still going to list him as a sit. We're going to be very careful with him. If he gets in full practices by the time the rankings come out, then we'll rank him somewhere. But if he doesn't, then I'm not putting him in the rankings just like last week. Then for Evan Engram. For Evan Engram, he is a must start right now for me. It's really hard not to start a tight end that is top 12 and most targets per game. And last week, he finally found the end zone, which was great and helped out the production a little bit. Should be covered this week by Denzel Perryman. He's covered 83 tight end routes run so far this year, and he's allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per route run at 0.38 against tight ends. Indianapolis and New England, and we'll call this a matchup of the most wasted tight end talents in football. Let's go ahead and call it that. Mo Cox, no problem, and Jelani Woods. Campbell's starting to, Paris Campbell finally healthy, making an impact, getting included in the game. Pittman and Pierce are still there. It's really hard for me to say either of these tight ends. If they score, that's great. They're startable. If they don't score, they're not, and more than likely, they're not going to score based on what we've seen number-wise. And then for Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry, again, it's outside of TJ Hockenson, they're probably one of the most, underutilized tight ends in the league. They've got the talent, they've got the ability to help you win games, and New England just doesn't seem to utilize them, even though they signed them to contracts that would expect that. Buffalo at the New York Jets, and a lot of people wanted to start Dawson Knox last week, and I was like, why are we starting Knox? Just because he scored 1 touchdown? And then he turns around and he scores another touchdown. But it's the same argument I had last week. He's only scored a touchdown. Over the last 2 games, he has 2 touchdowns, but he has 47 yards on 6 targets. So if he scores, he's still getting you less than 10 fantasy points per game. That's not what we need to be a start. To be a start, you have to have at least 10 half PPR points per game. If he doesn't score, you're going to get maybe 3, maybe 4 points if you're lucky. For me, I'm going to be looking at other options outside of Dawson Knox. For Tyler Conklin, we're going to go back to him this week. He's back in the fantasy spotlight after an injury to Corey Davis. Elijah Mitchell is more forgotten than that McDonald's toy that your kid dropped in between the seats 4 years ago. No one even knows that he's there, it seems like. So Elijah Moore, he's kind of out of the picture right now. Tyler Conklin, 2 touchdowns last week. We'll see if that continues. Not a great matchup, obviously, against Buffalo, but when you're going to have tough matchups on the outside, hopefully Conklin finds himself at least a few targets in this game. Minnesota and Washington, and here's where we're going to analyze even more of the TJ Hockenson trade. Now, we've got him listed here, and you're going to look at something you're going to say to yourself, Kyle, why does it say sit if he has 16 total points? I'm not starting him this week. He was traded on Tuesday, which means he's more than likely not going to get to Minnesota until maybe Tuesday night, early on Wednesday. So he's going to get maybe a couple of days of practice with them, just get the playbook, start trying to learn it. Do we really think that he's going to be a guy that's going to run out and make a fantasy impact right away? They're going to get him. They're going to get him some routes. They're going to get him, out on the field. That's fine. But I'm not really looking forward to trying to start TJ Hockenson in his first game with Minnesota. Now, Johnny Munt will probably end up being the guy. He did score a touchdown last week. Still not going to go with it this week. And Irv Smith Jr., he looks like he's going to be out for multiple weeks now. So what do we expect to see from TJ Hockenson? I expect to see a lot of run blocking. I expect them to utilize his full asset of talents, okay? However, you've still got guys on that team, including Justin Jefferson, who are the main target. Now, will TJ Hockenson take a little bit away from Adam Thielen? Yeah, that's probably going to happen. Is he going to take some away from Dalvin Cook? I wouldn't say he's going to take some away from Dalvin Cook because Dalvin Cook hasn't really made an impact in the passing game this year the way he has in the past. So for those of us that own Dalvin Cook that was hoping for some upside, probably not going to see a whole lot of it. For TJ Hockenson this week, though, he is a sit. I don't care what the points say. I don't care. He is a sit for me this week. If he has a great game, awesome. Congratulations. If he doesn't, though, I'm just not going to risk it. And then for Logan Thomas, good matchup. Thomas finally back last week, first game back from injury. Didn't make an impact of any kind. That's okay. Going to list him as a sit. We'll keep an eye on it. If you're desperate for a play, then maybe go with him, given that it is a better matchup. But just remember that if you're going with this option, it is highly risky, and you're hoping for maybe a decent amount of upside. Seattle and Arizona is going to bring me to my Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week. Don't forget, if you're looking for any Christmas ideas, head on over to manscaped.com. And when you check out, use code word headliner. You're going to get 25% off their entire order and free shipping at manscaped.com. Why is this my matchup to watch this week? Well, that's because Seattle allows the most fantasy points per game. And oh, look at that. Arizona allows the second most fantasy points per game. Good to see these two running into each other. Would love to give Mike Dissly the start this week, but can't do it. Can't give Dissly the start this week. Just too hard to trust right now. He's a high risk, high reward if he scores. The opportunity obviously there, but it could be there for Noah Fant as well. It could be there for Colby Parkinson. It could be there for any of the three tight ends that play. So if you're starting Dissly, you're hoping for that touchdown. For me, though, I'm just not going to risk it this week. For Zach Ertz, though, his target share has dropped each of the last two games. That's kind of that DeAndre Hopkins effect. He's been back the last two games. It looks good. And then, Rondale Moore last week had that breakout week that we predicted 2 weeks ago. They were just a week behind on. So he had a much better game last week. So Zach Ertz, we have to hope that we don't lose too many of the targets. The production should still be there if he gets the targets. We just don't want to lose too many of them. Given the matchup, given his production up to this time, I'm still going to start Zach Ertz. I'll just move him down in the rankings a little bit. But the good news for him is he is probably going to be shadowed by Cody Barton this week for Seattle. He's covered 185 tight end routes this season, and he's allowing 0.33 fantasy points per route run, which is sixth most in the league. He's averaging a 79% catch rate, and he's averaging 1.42 yards per route covered, which is fourth most in the league. Everything is set up for Zach Ertz to have a phenomenal game. The Rams and the Buccaneers and Tyler Higbee, a guy that was one of the safest tight ends in all of football, unfortunately had a bad game last week, but he still saw 6 targets. The dude right now is top 6 in most targets on a per game basis. With Van Jefferson back, even though he didn't do anything last week, maybe that does start to cut into Higbee just a little bit, but I'm still going to keep rolling with Higbee right now. He's a safe tight end. He has little upside, but the Buccaneers are allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so we'll roll him out again this week. And for Cade Otton, the Los Angeles Rams allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to tight ends. He's gotten a couple looks here and there in the red zone, but really nothing at this point that has said we've really got to start this dude. Tennessee and Kansas City, and while there's absolutely nothing to see on the Tennessee side, there's absolutely everything to see on the KC side with Travis Kelce in this matchup. Andy Reid coming out of the bye is always a smash win for the Kansas City Chiefs, it feels like. And in this matchup right here, I'm going to take Travis Kelce's 70.5 yards with the over on Prize Picks. I'm going to take that Prize Picks prop to play right there. Travis Kelce over 70.5 receiving yards going up against Tennessee. Tennessee, definitely think that he could be a guy that goes out and just dominates the entirety of the game this week. Monday Night Football is going to bring a whole lot of questions for us on the Baltimore side of the football. Mark Andrews was supposedly good to go last week, ended up re-injuring himself in the game or hurting himself in the game, then had to come out in the second quarter, and we didn't see anything from him the rest of the time. Isaiah Likely, boom, smashed in his absence, but no one was playing Isaiah Likely because Mark Andrews was playing. So Andrews does appear to have avoided major injury, but he's dealing with 2 injuries now. So we're going to have to monitor it closely. Now, it's hard to sit the tight end too. It's hard to sit Mark Andrews. If they say he's healthy and ready to play, how are you going to put him on the bench? It's really difficult to do that. So if my hope is that Baltimore, if for some reason he is still banged up, they just rule him as out, because then Isaiah Likely would become a must start for us at that point. Down below, though, for Juwan Johnson and Taysom Hill, Juwan Johnson's going to be a sit this week. 2 weeks ago, it worked out well for us. Last week, it did not. Taysom Hill last week, basically his entire amount of fantasy points coming from running the football. Nothing on the receiving side of it again for another week in a row. So when you take a look at a game against Baltimore, it's hard for me to assume that they're going to be running Taysom Hill all over the place. I'm very worried about it. He is a very risky start for me in this matchup. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to see you all later, though. Appreciate you tuning into this episode of the Fantasy Headliners. Lots of breaking news. I mean, I'm recording this with the trade deadline just a couple of hours away, so I got to get this done and get this out of the way in case there's big news. But ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you all tuning into this video. Hit that like button for me. I would much appreciate it. If you're new here, you got to subscribe down below and leave me a comment. Let me know which tight end y'all are thinking about starting this week and what you think you might get for them. I'm going to get out of here, though. Peace out. Stay safe. Stay healthy. And I'll catch y'all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.